Hi, my name is Scott Nelson, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the insights in my current book, Oceans of Grain. It was published in 2022 in the United States. It's translated into many other languages. It's currently the 2024 translation is taking place in China right now. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the big takeaways from that book. I was initially interested in the financial panic of 1873. This is back in 1985 when I was finishing my honors thesis as a historian. And I knew that the Panic of 1873, which is a massive financial panic that hits almost all over the world, not China, but much of the rest of the world, was not, in fact, caused by many of the things that other people said. They called it railroads in the United States. They called it um, uh, a property boom in Germany. Historians of Russia call it a overspeculation in railroad corridors. There are other explanations in Argentina. And so the historians have all got different explanations based on the kind of nations that they studied. But I knew from the railroad workers and railroad directors private correspondence about the Panic of 1873 as it was unfolding that it had everything to do with cheap American grain that was flooding the market. So I wanted to step back and sort of talk about that story. I didn't really intend to step back to 4000 BC, but the book that I did write is really a history of grain and its relationship to empires from about 4000 BC up until 1917. And the person who got me interested in this, who made me see it with bigger eyes, is someone who I was unintentionally following for quite a long time before I knew who he was. His name was Parvis. He was a revolutionary born in Belarus who grew up in Ukraine. And he explained the sort of creation of an international economy and its collapse in 1873 that made a whole lot of sense to me. And I understood, actually, after reading his work, he's a very important person, this guy Parvis, in help bringing about the creation of the modern Turkish state and bringing about the creation of the USSR. So let me start at the beginning. Black paths is one of the terms that I use. It's a Ukrainian term, chorny shlaki, and it describes the pathways that food traveled around the world. The black paths were the paths that were left by a group of people called the Chumaki, who were traders who delivered things with oxen, about 1,000 pounds, and they delivered grain, they delivered leather, they delivered fish. But grain was one of the things that they delivered across Ukraine and delivered them down to the Black Sea. And they said in the 1870s, when interviewed, that their histories went back thousands of years. Most people were were somewhat taken aback by this idea that there were for thousands of years, Chumaki had been traveling, delivering grain along these passageways. They said they delivered grain to ancient Rome, they delivered grain to ancient Greece. People were quite skeptical about this in the 1870s when these people were first identified. But it turns out that the Chumaki were probably right. We now know from DNA evidence that there was an international grain trade that was started about 4000 BC. It started in a city state called Trypillia, which is right outside of Kiev now, and and we know that plague apparently started there, this grain producing center, and we can tell by following the traces in the DNA of people's teeth of these prehistoric humans that grain and Yersinia pestis, the plague that traveled along with it, within the space of 100 years, in a very short period of time, traveled from Kiev all the way to Sweden and all the way to Manchuria. So we're not used to thinking about trade networks in the prehistoric period, the period before empires. But in fact, there seems to have been a great deal of trade. In fact, the Chumaki may have been right, that these black paths were ancient, indeed prehistoric, and precede the creation of most empires around the world. I was interested in this preservation of grain, which is a really important thing. In the ancient Greek city-states, uh, grain was transported from Ukraine, from Odessos and other ports around the Black Sea to um, the Greek city-states, Sparta and Athens and places like that. And I was interested in sort of how they described that, and I happened upon the story of Demeter and her daughter Persephone. It's a very old story. It's well known. She is well known in Europe. Demeter's daughter Persephone is captured around the time that there are flowers blooming. She's carried underground to hell, and her mother searches for her with a torch. And this seems to be this story of Demeter and Persephone. And then her mother goes down into hell, captures her, brings her back up, and then she prepares a dish of grain, which is she takes wheat, mixes it with water and penny water, and grinds it up and feeds it to a child who can't take her mother's milk. Now, this is a well-known story, but what I think is fairly clear is that this is really a story about how to hermetically save grain, how to store it underground. This was first proposed in the 1880s by an Oxford PhD. Not much followed up since then. But it is pretty clear that what the Greek city-states had in the ancient world was a way of capturing grain from a place like what's now Ukraine and transporting it over long distance dry. And the aristoi, the people who make their money from this trade, are made their fortunes really doing this. And why is this important? Well, that long distance travel for grain over the ocean takes place in the period of the Greek city-states in the ancient world, but there doesn't seem to be a long-distance trade in grain in very, very large ships from a period of about 400 or so AD until 1810. From 400 to 1810, the secret of how to store grain underground appears to have been lost. And so that a network that the Greeks had for delivering that grain over water in the ancient world seems to have been lost. Okay, so that's the story, and I'll talk about that 1810 discovery in a minute. I want to talk now about Constantinople, because we can't really understand why this grain was so important without understanding Constantinople. It was initially Byzantium. There's a strait there that is 1 mile wide, and that strait was the key constriction point between trade between the East and the West. So the prehistoric Silk Road, before there existed a Silk Road, there seems to have been a prehistoric Silk Road that delivered goods from Manchuria all the way to the Black Sea. And then to get from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Ocean, the grain had to pass through a very narrow corridor that was exactly 1 mile wide. And Byzantium is formed in the ancient world to guard that and to charge a tax on the delivery of that grain, and not just grain, but spices, silks, all sorts of other things that pass through here. This then becomes Constantine in the Roman Empire takes over Byzantium. It's ultimately renamed after him to Constantinople. In 1453, that passageway is captured by the Turks and becomes Istanbul. So why is this important? Why? Well, if we think about food traveling from the Black Sea, where there's a tremendous abundance of it, to the rest of the world, in the Byzantine Empire, in the Ottoman Empire, it's clear that it's being at those gates that is crucial for control and taxation of that delivery. Okay, so we have a world in which there is flour that's traded, but every time that there's a big grain trading network over a long distance, after a few hundred years or so, we see plague that comes along with it. So in the ancient world, there's a thing called the Neolithic decline that happens about 3000 BC. And the Neolithic decline, as I said, starts in Kiev and moves all the way to Manchuria and all the way to Sweden. Again, in the plague of Justinian in around 453, we see likewise a spread of this plague, this time mostly over the Mediterranean and through Europe, takes out 1/3 of the population. And of course, it starts in Alexandria, but the really central node is Constantinople. Okay. So I'm going to get back to why this is important in a minute, but let me talk to you about the center of the book, which is the competition between the United States and the Russian Empire to feed Europe. This comes out of this idea of feeding other empires would have been foreign to Julius Caesar, to the Chinese emperors, to emperors in India or elsewhere. But there's a new kind of doctrine that emerges in the 1760s or so, the group of people, economists called the physiocrats. And the physiocrats have a story that every empire depends on food primarily, and that the lower the tax on farmers, the more successful the empire will be. This may be familiar to Chinese audiences. This is a new idea in the 1750s. They come up with an idea called the economy, which refers to the delivery of food around the empire. This is probably lifted from the ancient Chinese philosopher Mencius, who likewise had a story. He saw the Warring States period in China, and he had a kind of story about how the success of empire depends fundamentally on the ability to deliver food over long distances, to share food, to save food. And this is why Persephone's secret is going to become important, that secret of saving grain dry underground or in ships. So from the other part of the physiocratic story is that you need to not tax farmers, but to provide them every capacity that's available to them. But you also need to make sure that if you have any extra, that you do feed other empires with it. You sell that grain to other empires. And so in the midst of the conflict that is burning in France, the French Revolution, and then the Napoleonic invasion of Europe, in that period, Russia determines that it is going to feed the world on physiocratic principles. Catherine II of Russia captures the area north of the Black Sea in what's now Ukraine in a series of battles. After she does so, she founds the city of Odessa after the ancient Greek city-state of Odessos, and she starts to ship out flour from this region and some dried grain. It can only go a short distance because there hasn't yet been a sort of way of saving grain in very large quantities for very long stretches of time. And it's in this world that Russia expands. So the Russian Empire, which is relatively small and relatively weak, all the way up until the 1750s, becomes a powerful empire by feeding the rest of the world. The grain goes to Livorno in what's now Italy. The grain is dried again and then transported to Amsterdam and Antwerp and London and other ports around Europe that are prepared to pay for grain. This the other country that tries to take on these physiocratic principles to sort of try to understand how to build a state in which education is at the center and which farmers are least taxed is the United States. Both Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson are obsessed with the physiocrats, and they build the U.S. Constitution in that kind of model in which farmers are at the center. They should be taxed as little as possible, and the taxing industry and other things like that make perfect sense. And so the United States and Russia are both competing to feed Europe. Now, the United States can feed Russia, can feed the rest of Europe only occasionally because the grain sours and things like that. Russia's grain delivery has to take place in multiple stages. This all changes around 1810 when Napoleon, who is bent on invading Eastern Europe invading Russia, capturing all of Europe on what's called a continental plan, is obsessed with discovering how to hermetically seal grain. So that's back to Persephone's secret, as I've called it. He sends a Eugene Chaptal down to Rome after he's captured Rome, and he's a chemist and he does excavations, and they look into Roman granaries from the period before 500. And what they find are charred bits of grain, they find some dust, they find a large contraption that seems to be driving the grain around, and Chaptal reverse engineers the hermetic sealing of grain. He says what you need to do is to take the grain, you need to warm it slightly, and then you need to spin it. You need to turn it around so that all the grains dry evenly. And over time, the grain loses oxygen and the seed itself. And when the seed loses oxygen, it goes into a state that is frozen, basically. So we know that plants breathe in oxygen and they breathe out, sorry, the plants breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen, but seeds breathe in oxygen, yes, breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide just like we do. And so it goes into a sleeping state, just like Persephone, who goes to sleep and then goes underground. Chaptal provides this information to Napoleon. Napoleon is interested in storing grain for long sieges. Unfortunately, he has already begun his attack on Russia, and as we know, the attack on Russia fails catastrophically. But Chaptal publishes his results around 1815. They're instantly translated into English, and this is where we get what in Europe is called the silo, and what in the United States is called the grain elevator. Basically a massive tower with grain where the grain can be spun and dried, poured into a large container, and held for many, many years. This is a really important transformation for both Russia and the United States because it means that you can transport grain over very long distances, just like the Aristoi did. And so the competition between the United States and Russia amps up as the European cities start to expand. Many of the large imperial states that emerge in the 1790s and forward have a plan where the peasants are going to eat potatoes who are on the ground. The peasants who are in rural places are going to grow potatoes and eat them. But they're going to take grain, they're going to dry it, they're going to transport it to the city centers so that city centers can grow, so that you can have urbanization, so that you can have industrialization, so that you can have powerful empires. This means that while European states are somewhat wary of grain coming in from Russia and from the United States, they necessarily recognize that in times of famine that this grain is important. They impose a tariff barrier on this grain and try to block it. But Russian grain and American grain is so cheap that it still comes into those places. This changes drastically in 1846. In 1846, a water mold called Phytophthora infestans is the Latin name, and it infects the potato. It infects the potato and is transported by air. So unlike Yersinia pestis, the plague, which is transported by rats and mice, rats and mosquitoes to humans, the plague has to travel in the bloodstream. Phytophthora infestans can travel in the air. It's that small, and it grows and it colonizes inside the potato, and it causes famine in Europe. And so the European states face a terrible problem because they want to grow grain, have their rural regions send grain into the city, but the potato that's supposed to feed those rural regions is gone. What will Europe do? Britain responds to this by basically eliminating tariffs on grain so that there will be no more tax on grain coming into those states. No one thinks that this is going to solve make these countries rich. They just believe that to avoid revolution, they need to do this. 1 million people die in Ireland, for example, the rural place that had been growing grain for the UK, for Britain, for London and Liverpool and those big British cities. And so the plague is, the Yersinia, Phytophthora infestans is a really important problem. And so all this, first Germany, and then the United States, the UK, the United Kingdom, and then all the other European states start to lower their tariff barriers to nothing, basically allowing grain to come in. So that cheap Russian and cheap American grain is mostly Russian grain at this point, because Russia is so much closer to Europe. And this Russian grain floods into Europe after 1846. And so this is the beginning of what we call economic liberalism, but it's not an attempt to make anyone rich. It's an attempt to avoid revolution. And this is precisely how it's put in the time in the UK. What we do know now is that by having free trade in Europe, by eliminating barriers to grain and other goods, we see tremendous economic growth, tremendous economic development, tremendous economic development of cities. The person that I am now channeling is a person called Parvis. He's a communist from Belarus, and he says that after the 1846, that Europe develops what are called gullet cities, cities that absorb food, and cheap food coming from Russia in particular. And so this cheap food means that for the first time in the world, we think, food is cheaper in cities than in the countryside, because all this grain that's coming over the ocean from Russia is so inexpensive compared to local grain that it leads to massive economic transformation. And because food in the cities is cheaper than in the countryside, then what it means is that poor people will leave the countryside and go to the city where food is less expensive. And this allows manufacturers to take advantage of these formerly rural people and employ them in little factories around London, around Liverpool, around Antwerp, around Amsterdam. These cities become the gullet cities, absorb all this cheap grain. And if we look at the grain itself, it's very, very cheap in cities, and weirdly, it's more expensive in the rural areas in Europe. Okay, so the next story I tell is about capitalism and slavery. It's an old argument, but what I am here to tell you is that in the 1850s and the 1860s, there was a war between capitalism and slavery, and that took place both in Russia during the Crimean War and after, and in the United States in the American Civil War. Much of Europe in these gullet cities were buying bonds from both Russia and the United States. Russia was using these bonds to fund the expansion into Ukraine so that it could then build armies that would move outward and expand both east and west. The other place that's selling bonds is railroad companies in the United States. And I call these people the boulevard barons. Now, let me step back a second and talk about the word robber barons. We talk about robber barons now, we are usually referring to wealthy capitalists who hoard too much in the terms of resources. The robber barons actually is a term to describe the Middle Ages. And the robber barons sat on rivers and stopped grain from passing through, stopped other goods, furs and things like that from passing through. They charged a tax on it. And as European states expanded in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, they wiped out the robber barons. They came in, they took down their castles, they prevented the robber barons from taxing the internal trade on the state. These boulevard barons are a little bit like that, but instead, I call them boulevard barons instead because they're not robbing directly. They're not slowing trade. They actually want to speed up trade, but they still want to tax it. And so what they do is they build a new financial instrument called the railroad bond. And the railroad bond is attractive if you want to earn 6 to 7%, which is a good return on investment in Europe in the 1850s or so. And the railroad is effectively acting as a bank. It's given land by Congress in the United States. It takes that land, it turns them into bonds, People will buy the land. They're transported to the to over the railroad, overseas, and then over to the railroad. They land. They're sold land, but they're sold in installments. And those installments every year, for the space of 4 or 5 years, ideally, you pay a certain amount for your grain. That amount goes to pay bonds, and those bonds then reimburse people who invest initially in the railroads by not invest but become bondholders for the railroads. So Russia is issuing bonds, which are expanding the Russian state, and these United States corporate types connected with the names that you're probably familiar with. John Murray Forbes is one of them. Where we get Forbes magazine, they are interested in collateralizing that debt, taking farmers, letting them settle, having them pay off the land that is given to them by Congress, which they in turn give to the farmers, and those bonds are then how everyone is paid off. This capitalism and slavery is a war between two kinds of bonds, between the Russian bonds and between the United States bonds, because ultimately, when the Crimean War takes place and Russia invades the Black Sea and tries to take Istanbul for the fifth time between 1790 and 1853, this time Europe responds, and Europe prevents Russia from moving into and potentially capturing Istanbul. The Crimean War then pits all of Russia against not just Turkey, but also France and Great Britain, who have all together collaborated to stop Russia's control of grain in this region. Why is this important? Because in 1853, when the Russian Crimean War started, Russia blocked trade going out of the Black Sea through Istanbul, through Constantinople. And this means that all the grain coming from Romania and places like this cannot get to Europe. All the grain from Ukraine that comes to Europe cannot come to Europe. And this leads prices to double or go almost up about, not double, to go up about 60% in Great Britain and in France. And this is unacceptable. And so for this and partly for this reason, because they see Russia as invading in this area, we see a Crimean War. Russia is defeated in the Crimean War, and Russia goes almost bankrupt. The response to this by Russia is this complicated trajectory where a new kind of bond is created. This bond is going to be sold to investors. There had been existing bonds that had been sold to investors that were supposed to pay for mortgaged land that very, very large landowners owned. Russia works out a deal where people will buy their freedom in these lands. So people who are serfs, very much like slaves in the U.S. context, will buy their freedom after the Crimean War is over. And the payments that they will make will be in cash, and the cash that will be collected will be used to pay off the Russian bondholders, most of whom are in Britain or Germany or in France. And so this saves the Russian Empire by effectively ending slavery over time in the Russian Empire. And this is why I say this is a kind of conflict between capitalism and slavery, because basically to save itself, the Russian Empire does this. It frees the serfs by having them buy their freedom and paying back the bondholders. In the United States, the conflict is a little bit different. The conflict is between the boulevard barons on the one hand, who want to expand into the Great Plains, very flat plains, which are excellent for growing wheat, but they are blocked by a group of Southerners who are slaveholders and who have very powerful in Congress, and they're called the F Street Mess. And the F Street Mess basically does not want any more of these bonded railroads to go to the West, because they believe it will bring in too many immigrants, which will unbalance the North and the South. Lots of free immigrants in the North who will settle on these plots of land along the railroads will give them more power. And the conflict is really over Kansas. This is really what starts the war, is the plains of Kansas, which is excellent land for growing wheat. Who will control it? Will it be slaveholders, or will it be free settlers, basically small farmers, not small, medium-sized farmers, people who grow about 1,000 acres or more of wheat in these regions. And then this leads to what's called Bleeding Kansas in 1857, which is really an important precursor, 56 and 57, precursor to the American Civil War. For the first time, Americans are fighting Americans over land. It's northern, the robber barons who are connected to the Secret Six, who are funding John Brown and others who are support the Union, and slaveholders who are sending people into Kansas to try to claim the same land. The conflicts over Bleeding Kansas helped spill into the American Civil War. And ultimately, as we know, slavery is ended. This does become a war over slavery. But it's more about, as I would argue, the war starts as a conflict over westward expansion, and I explain that in the Capitalism and Slavery chapter. Okay, so we still have Russia as the #1 exporter of grain in the world. That changes during the Civil War. Why? Because the South is the biggest exporter in the United States is cotton. Cotton is blocked off by the Union in the blockade. The Confederacy tries to sell bonds for its cotton. It sells one, the Erlanger loan, but it cannot really succeed in Europe. The United States is much more successful in this regard. But to get foreign exchange, the United States has to have something as valuable as cotton that it can ship out. Two things change in the Civil War. The first is 4 competing railroad corridors connecting Chicago, which is right next to the Great Plains, these railroad corridors that go from Chicago all the way to deep water in the east. Chicago, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, the Erie, 5 of them. And these 4 railroads, Chesapeake and Ohio is not there. So Erie, Penn, New York Central, and B&O are 4 railroad corridors that connect the east to the west, and those are supported by the president. The president says that there absolutely has to be a permanent railway corridor to ship goods back and forth to defend the Union. The other thing that emerges is the futures market, a modern futures market. And that is not, as most people have said, something that's invented by the Chicago Board of Trade. It's actually invented in collaboration with the U.S. Army, because the U.S. Army has a serious problem with oats. They are trapped. I talk about this in the war itself. They're trapped in Chattanooga. The only way they can feed the hundreds of thousands of horses that the Union Army has is to defeat the 7 or 8 grain monopolists who are in control of oats. They're the only ones who can provide 10,000 bushels of oats at a time to the Union Army. The U.S. breaks the order into thousands of orders of 100 bushels each for oats. And these are bought and sold on the Chicago Board of Trade. And so anyone who can come up with 100 bushels of oats can end up feeding the Union Army. They don't know that it's the Union Army that they're feeding, although they can guess it because this is the middle of a war. But these are private contracts. They're secret contracts. You don't know who the buyer, the formal buyer is at the end. The seller is also, the seller is not a mystery, but the buyer is a mystery because these things can be traded very easily. And the U.S. wanted to hide its hand to make it clear that it didn't want anyone to know that it was desperately in need of oats. So the futures market is important because once the transatlantic telegraph is finished, after the Civil War is over, it is possible to buy grain in Chicago on one day and sell it in Liverpool on the same day. And you make an adjustment in price for the delivery. And rather than a 30% margin that would be charged by a merchant, margins go down to 1%. So the merchants only get about 1% of the value, the difference between the purchase price in Chicago and the purchase price in London, accounting for the food delivery prices. This allows people to sell millions of bushels of grain from Chicago direct to London, direct to Liverpool, direct to Antwerp, direct to Amsterdam, direct to the major deep water ports, the gullet cities of Europe. And so that's how the United States steals a march, to use an old phrase, on Russia, because Russia is further away. It's not in as deep water, but the United States is able to sell basically a graded quantity of grain in the tens of thousands of bushels, enough to provide a baker with 3 months of supply, for example, and 1,000 bakers can be supplied with one massive steamship coming from, or massive sailing ships coming from the United States to Europe. Now, this is how the United States beats Russia in this international trade. It has a transatlantic market. The transatlantic telegraph. I also talk about nitroglycerin, which makes it possible to deepen ports so that very large ships can come into them. And I talk about how it is that the United States shifts from being a minor player in the international trade in grain to being a major player. Okay, so the United States during the war needed foreign exchange, and so it sold grain to do that. After the war, it sells oceans of grain to Europe, and so that's the story of the book. And I learned that in part from Parvis, this Marxist intellectual who is in Odessa, who sees, born in 1867, who sees the change that takes place in 1872 and 1873 as Russia is no longer the provisioner of Europe and the United States becomes the provisioner of Europe. Something like 60% of the grain is coming from Russia in 1850. Something like 70% of the grain is coming from the United States by 1874. This transformation is very important. It leads to a global economic catastrophe. Because existing trading relations, which had been built on merchants who had grain in storage that was sitting in cities, that provided sterling bills of exchange, another kind of credit instrument that banks needed. These sterling bills of exchange become quite worthless by the 1870s as grain prices plummet. They go down because so much cheap American grain is coming through these areas. Now, okay, so that's what I call the Panic of 1873. I call it a great grain crisis. And that's what Parvis called it. He said that this world crash was the sort of closest thing that we were going to have to an economic catastrophe in his lifetime. And the next one would bring, he believed, revolution. He was a committed Marxist, but also grew up in a family where he was very closely connected to the grain trade. I believe his brother and possibly his father were very large grain traders in Odessa. He was a communist, but from a relatively well-off bourgeois family. Okay, so what does this do, this cheap grain? The Phytophthora infestans, that potato mold, has opened up free trade throughout Europe. That's not going away. Gradually, though, some European states impose little barriers on grain prices. Why? Because grain prices have gotten so low that we see Ricardo's paradox emerge. And I explain that, but basically what it is landlords are hurt because their land is worth less as all this cheap American grain comes over. What happens is the ships going back from Europe to the United States, they come back almost empty. And so as a result, immigrants come over on those ships. And this is how we see a massive movement of immigration on the very same ships that are bringing grain over. The compartment in which grain is stored, the steerage compartment, becomes the compartment which little walls are put in and people are set up in these regions so that they can travel back to the United States. And so in the wake of all this cheap grain coming into Europe, there's a flow of people coming back to Europe, to the United States. Okay, Who benefits most from this in Europe? What I call the grain powers of Europe, but which other people would call the great powers of Europe. And that is Germany, France, and Italy. Because those three countries are kind of being created in this period. France has existed for a longer period of time, but Germany and Italy are newly created effectively in the 1860s. And they impose, Germany, France, and Italy all impose a small tax on grain that's coming in, not enough to block it, but enough that it provides a tremendous bounty to these European states. And they, as Marxists put it at the time, they picked workers' pockets to build battleships. And so this tax that they imposed, a very small tax on the grain coming in, was enough to basically create a massive and really important European powers. These European powers do in fact build battleships, and this is when we see, in the wake of all of this cheap grain coming in the wake of the creation of these new European states, we see the scramble for Africa. As European states, which now have figured out how to use steamships that can go up and down rivers, are obsessed with finding new markets because the United States has found a market in Europe. Europe wants to find a market elsewhere. And so this we see in the wake of the tremendous flow of grain that's coming from the United States and Europe, which doesn't stop, doesn't really even slow down, helps to create what we think of as the scramble for Africa. It's around this period that we also see China, of course, try to invade, and the Opium Wars are slightly before this and slightly after this. As much of the Third World, what we now call the Third World, much of the Middle East, much of Africa, much of Asia is carved up by these European powers, which suddenly have wealth in the form of battleships. Okay, so I then go on to talk about how Russia responds to the competition from the United States, to this tremendously cheap grain that's coming in. And the solution to this problem is to build the longest railroad in the world, connecting Russia to Manchuria. And so this railroad, this Great Eastern Railway, is going to fix Russia's problems. Because as Russia sees it, the people in charge, the railroad directors who are effectively running Russia at this point, there's a czar there, but many of the most important decisions are being made by people who are connected with the powerful railroads. They build this railroad because they want Dalian. They want what they call Port Arthur, which will provide them a deep water port to sell grain from the Urals and from across Asia and Russia, sell grain out of a deep water port, which will then compete with the United States. Now, as you know, or probably know, I'm sure you know, in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, Japan defeated Russia and said, you cannot have Dalian, and the Japanese briefly control that region. They steal it from China. Okay, so the Japanese plot this destruction, and they're successful. They have battleships, and those battleships destroy the much smaller and much more moribund and broken Russian fleet. People who are connected with the Russian Empire at the time, the diplomats and others, say this is the end of Russia. Russia is over in 1905. It has issued hundreds of millions of rubles worth of bonds to connect these planes to a deep water port in the LOC at Dalian. They no longer have this. And so Russia will never be able to pay back these debts. Russia will be through. Russia will be over. Russia will never be able to sell bonds in Europe again, which will mean it'll never have wars, be able to fund wars again, which will mean gradually Russia will collapse either from without or from within. These are prescient words. In 1905, there is a revolution. And here my friend Parvis comes into play. Parvis, between the 1870s and 1900, is talking about revolution. Now, you haven't heard of him, but you might have heard about the people who he most influenced. Parvis was his pen name. His born name was Alexander Helfand. But the people who did influence were Nikolai Lenin, sorry, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka Lenin, Vladimir Lenin, who reads Parvis's writings about the great 1873 financial crisis, about the coming revolution that's connected with cheap food, and is persuaded that a revolution in Russia is possible. He also persuades Rosa Luxemburg, who is goes by the name Junius. And Rosa Luxemburg, also coming from Poland and a timber region in Poland, says in her private letters that everything I learned about the mass strike and international capitalism I learned from Parvis. That's where I first discovered Parvis's name. Rosa Luxemburg creates a story about a world system of capitalism that we now call world systems theory. But she has this argument that a core is going to depend on raw materials coming from the periphery, and this goes back to writings that Parvis has written in the 1880s about the kind of international situation, written initially in popular newspapers for a working class audience in the United States. Another person you might have heard of is Leon Trotsky, who is also persuaded by Parvis, and he also comes from the area that is Ukraine, now in Ukraine. And he says Ukraine is Russia's America. It is the wealthiest part of Russia. It is the part that does not really belong with the rest of Russia, that it's advanced and the rest of Russia is backwards. He also makes the argument for permanent revolution, arguing that the only way the revolution can succeed is to constantly expand. Okay, so what Parvis does in 1901 is, in his basically large apartment, he creates Iskra, I-S-K-R-A, the Spark, which is the first magazine of the first newspaper of the Russian Social Democratic Party, which will become eventually the Communist Party of Russia. Okay, so that's 1904, 1905. Parvis creates the first Soviet along with Trotsky in Petersburg. These Soviets try to take control of the Russian state. This is the revolution of 1905 that follows from the Russo-Japanese War. Parvis is captured along with Trotsky, and they are sent to Peter and Paul Fortress, where they will be executed, is the plan, after a trial. Luckily, Parvis has apparently managed to bring in diamonds in the soles of his shoes, and uses those to bribe his guards to escape. And he and Trotsky escape. Parvis goes to Istanbul. And here again, Istanbul. Parvis says there is no more important place in the world than Constantinople, than Istanbul. It is the center of the world's trade. He says if there is a world war that is coming, and it is coming, it will start in the Balkans, and it will be over Constantinople and over the strait at Constantinople. And so he goes to Turkey, and in this point, the Young Turks have taken over Turkey, so it's gone from the Ottoman Empire, ruled by the Sultan, to a constitutional democracy. And he's an advisor to them. And he says, all right, the first thing you need to do is build up your grain production, because you can't succeed in this world unless you're a large grain exporter. Istanbul, the area that is Turkey, is an excellent place for producing grain. You need to build railroads to those places. They need to be funded very much like the way that the United States funds this. And he says, emulate the United States in the construction of these railroads. The railroads are not through the mountains. The railroads are through the plains. And you produce grain and you sell it for export. And this will make Turkey, the modern Turkey, a powerful state. He says that Turkey has been robbed, just like China has been robbed, by these states within a state. The Ottoman Public Debt Association in Turkey is paying off the bonds that have been contracted by the Turkish government, but they have collected much more money than they have to pay. And so this is a serious problem. And You basically need to not pay those debts. So that's what Parvis says, and he says you need to build artillery, and you need to build it on right near the strait, and right near Gallipoli. He also says you need to buy a battleship because this is the world that we are in. They create a lottery to buy a battleship. A battleship is on its way to allegedly on its way from Britain to Turkey in 1914. Russia is terrified because the Russian Empire is terrified because just as a couple of battleships in Japan had wiped out the Russian Navy is not yet in a position, having recovered yet from 1905, to fight, and Turkey could defeat Russia in the Black Sea as they see it. And so they are very opposed to Turkey getting this dreadnought. And they also recognize that there's a new black path that is being created that is, as they see it, a terrifying one. It is the Orient Express. It is a railroad that goes from Germany all the way through the Balkans and through the Ottoman Empire, crosses the strait and goes into the Middle East. This black path, as Germany sees it, is a new corridor for the delivery of goods back and forth, so that Germany can get grain and other goods. Germany can export manufactured goods. This is a mortal threat to Russia. Russia says, if this railroad touches the Black Sea, we will destroy the port. So this is Krivoshin, the director, effectively the head of the cabinet in Russia, says, if we see a port for this railroad that is on the Black Sea, we will destroy the port. Okay, so we usually tell the story of 1914. We usually tell the story of World War I as a story about German aggression, and that's not crazy because most people writing about World War I were writing after World War II, and Germany World War II was an aggressor, certainly. But the story is better told as a story about Russian aggression, because after Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, Russia puts troops right on the border with Austria, almost all of its troops right on the border with Austria, threatening to invade at any moment. Russia is, of course, connected. It's not the cause of the execution of Franz Ferdinand, but they did fund it in part. They provided the pistols and the training and the bombs that are used in the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And so we should actually think about Russia as being potentially an important aggressor in this. This is not new to me. Sean McMeekin has made this argument relatively recently, and I think it's a very important one. It's an old argument, but Sean McMeekin, who reads Russian, has identified lots and lots of documents that make it clear that Russia is clearly the aggressor here. Okay, so World War I, as I argue, is a war over bread, because Parvis's idea about the battleship that was prescient, it was also prescient to build artillery right along the strait, because as it happens, Germany and Turkey will be on one side, the Axis powers, on the other side, Great Britain, France, and then on the other side, Russia. And so what's separating Russia on the one side from Great Britain and France? Well, it's possible to get through the Black Sea from Russia to Great Britain and France, but not easily going past Germany. And really, there's the ports in the north are not very good in this period. The way for Russia to feed Germany and France during this, the way for Russia to feed Britain and France during this war will have to be through the strait. And the way for Russia to get arms from France and Great Britain has to be through the strait as well. And so, as Turkey becomes on the side of Germany in this conflict, as you probably know, if you know much about World War One, the British and the all of its empire is blocked at the Strait of Gallipoli, and basically Russia has grain to plenty in Ukraine at the time, but France and Great Britain are in serious trouble. Much of France's wheat fields are on fire with this conflict. There are battle lines through these regions, and Britain is starved of food. And and so this is a calculated decision by Parvis, who, as I again told you, tells us the story of the Black Paths, says don't pay attention to countries, pay attention to the trade, pay attention to these corridors of food. What Parvis does is makes a proposition in 1915 to, or 16 to Germany. I can solve your food problem, because Germany is having a food problem too. It used to get much of its food from Russia and the United States. Russia is an enemy at this point. The United States will soon be an enemy. And so where's Germany going to get its grain? The winter of 1914, 1915 is terrible in Russia. The solution, Parvis says, is I can get you grain from the North Sea. I can get you Russian grain over the North Sea. He knows where most of the grain traders have stored grain. He says he can buy it. He can use neutral countries like Denmark and Sweden to transport the grain under neutral flags. He only needs 1,000,000 Deutschmarks, which is quite a bit of money in this period, to start this transportation operation, and he will provide grain. So Russia has plenty of grain, and he's going to get it smuggled into Germany. In response, all Germany has to do is send a sealed train of Bolsheviks and Mensheviks to the Finland station in Petersburg, where a revolution will start. And so Parvis plans the Russian Revolution. Now, he's not hardly ever discussed as an important person in starting the Russian Revolution, but he's absolutely critical. He makes a great deal of money bringing medicines into Russia, bringing grain out of Russia to feed Germany, bringing German medicines within. Almost all of this money, I mean, he has a lavish lifestyle, but almost all of this money goes directly to the Bolsheviks for machine guns and for newspapers to spread help support the Bolsheviks. Parvis is a communist. He's a committed communist. On the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, he was somewhat divided. He believes that Lenin is ruthless, but he will be effective. And he's right. He's right. Basically, most of what Parvis predicts comes true. And those railroad corridors, those black paths matter because there is first the February Revolution, in which the liberal powers and the socialist powers and the Mensheviks, some of the Mensheviks, are a kind of ruling party through the Duma. The Bolsheviks do not like this, and they try to overthrow that revolution, and they do so in part by organizing the unions in the railroad regions and blocking grain to come from Ukraine, which is where it's, or the Ukrainian part of the Russian Empire, into the Russian part of the Russian Empire. There's famine in Petersburg and Moscow, which helps to support the revolution. The Bolsheviks say that when they come to power, they will provide food, and they are successful. Parvis, who is a communist, is quite concerned about what the Russians have done, the Soviets have done. He himself was a very strong supporter of the Soviet. He created the first Soviet. He basically lives the rest of his life in Germany. He's relatively well off, and he dies shortly after World War I. So this is the story of Oceans of Grain. What I started to write about, which is the story of the Panic of 1873, became a story instead about understanding how grain brings about power and how food, measured in calories, makes two physiocratic empires that are fighting in a kind of conflict, an economic conflict with each other, to a conclusion And by 1873, the United States has effectively defeated Russia as the provisioner of Europe. Thanks so much for your time, and I'd love to hear your comments. srnelson@uga.edu. Thanks so much.